A cowboy came for supplies, found a widow starving in the cellar, and made her his own. The morning sun rose slowly over the rolling plains, painting the sky with shades of gold and soft pink.
Dust swirled gently in the cool morning air, and the faint sound of a creek running nearby mixed with the distant calls of birds. The cowboy rode steadily along the worn dirt path, his horse's hooves crunching softly against the hard ground. He was a man of few words, known to the townsfolk as quiet, dependable, and someone who preferred the company of his horse and the open road to that of people. Today, however, he had a purpose. He needed supplies. The trail had been long and his provisions were running low. He adjusted his hat against the rising sun and looked across the horizon, scanning for the small settlement he had been told about a day earlier. The town was little more than a cluster of weathered wooden buildings, some leaning with age, others freshly patched but still showing scars from years of storms and neglect. As he approached, the sound of creaking signboards and the faint chatter of people going about their morning routines welcomed him. The cowboy felt the familiar sense of caution settle in his chest. Towns were tricky places. People could be kind, or they could be suspicious of a stranger passing through. He guided his horse into the dusty street, tying it outside a general store with a rough, sun-bleached rope. Inside, the store smelled of dried herbs, leather, and a faint tang of metal from the tools stacked along the walls.
Shelves were lined with cans, sacks of grain, and neatly folded blankets. The owner, an older man with a thick beard and a gentle smile, greeted him with a nod but said nothing more.
The cowboy was used to silence. Words were often unnecessary when intentions were clear. As he checked his list, he overheard whispers from two women near the counter. They spoke softly, almost as if afraid to be overheard, yet their words carried a certain urgency. The widow. "She's barely surviving," one said. "They say she hasn't had a proper meal in days. Living alone, with no one to care for her." The cowboy paused, listening. He wasn't one to involve himself in others' business, but something about the tone, the mix of concern and quiet despair, caught his attention. The world was full of stories, and sometimes they reached you when you least expected it. Finishing his purchases, he asked the owner about the widow. The man looked uneasy, scratching the back of his neck.
"Not much to tell, really," he said. "Her husband passed a while back.
She's been managing on her own, but folks say she's struggling. Lives in that old house on the edge of town."
"Not many go near it." The cowboy nodded silently, paying for his goods and slinging them over his shoulder.
As he walked down the street, he noticed how the town seemed alive with quiet tension. Children played in the dirt outside a wooden schoolhouse, women hung laundry on lines between buildings, and men gathered near the blacksmith's forge. Yet, in every glance he received, he felt the weight of unspoken stories. Some faces carried curiosity, others worry, and some, barely concealed, seemed indifferent. The house he was directed to was easy to spot from a distance. Unlike the other structures, it seemed forgotten by time. The paint had peeled long ago, leaving the wooden boards exposed and weathered. Shutters hung at uneven angles, and weeds had overtaken the small yard. The roof sagged slightly in the middle as if burdened by years of neglect. Still, there was a faint curl of smoke rising from the chimney, a subtle sign that life persisted within its walls. The cowboy approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the overgrown path. He called out in a low voice, but no answer came. The door was slightly ajar, and he pushed it gently, stepping inside. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and something faintly sweet, like dried herbs. The room was small, with simple furniture covered in dust. A rocking chair sat in the corner, unmoved for days, perhaps weeks. He glanced around carefully, sensing that someone might be hiding or too weak to answer. A cellar door, partially hidden beneath a faded rug, caught his eye. He knelt and lifted it slowly. A cold draft escaped, carrying a damp, earthy smell that told him the space below had been sealed from sunlight for a long time. Descending the creaking steps, he saw her. The widow was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, knees drawn close to her chest. Her clothes were worn and patched, and her hair fell loosely around her face. She looked up, startled, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. She was smaller than he expected, frail from days without proper food or care. She had tried to survive, but the toll of isolation and hunger was evident in every line on her face. The cowboy's heart tightened. He knelt a short distance away and spoke gently. "I'm not here to hurt you.
Just came to see if you need help."
His voice was calm, steady, and carried no judgment, only concern. The widow hesitated, then slowly nodded, too weak to speak. She accepted the water he offered, sipping it carefully.
Each drop seemed to revive her just a little, as though hope itself was seeping back into her. He reached into his bag and took out some bread and dried meat, placing it on a cloth near her.
She looked at it with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for it. I didn't expect anyone," she whispered, voice barely audible. He nodded, understanding more in her silence than she could say.
As she ate, he asked gently about her life.
She spoke slowly, recalling her husband's passing, the gradual decay of her home, and the loneliness that had settled like a heavy cloak over her days.
Her words were tinged with sadness, but there was also resilience.
She had survived this long despite everything.
He listened, not interrupting, letting her share her story on her own terms.
Hours passed like minutes as he stayed with her, repairing small things around the cellar, cleaning the space, and making sure she was comfortable. He didn't ask for gratitude, didn't demand anything in return.
Helping her was enough. When he finally prepared to leave, he promised he would return with more supplies, perhaps even stay for a while if she wanted company. She nodded quietly, a faint smile appearing as the first light of hope returned to her eyes.
Rising back to the main floor, the cowboy paused at the door.
He looked out over the small yard, the weeds and broken boards softened by the morning sun. He thought about the long road ahead and the many travelers and towns he would encounter. But something about this small house, this frail widow, had etched itself into his mind. Sometimes a simple act of kindness could change the course of a life for both the giver and the receiver. As he rode back toward the town, supplies balanced on his horse, the cowboy couldn't help but glance back at the house on the edge of town. The memory of her eyes, tired but grateful, stayed with him. For the first time in a long while, he felt a pull towards something beyond his usual travels, something that involved care, compassion, and perhaps a new beginning. The plain stretched endlessly ahead, but now, somewhere among the hills and the dust, there was a story waiting to unfold, and he was a part of it. That day, the cowboy learned that courage wasn't just about facing storms on the open road. Sometimes it was about stepping into a quiet, forgotten place and offering help when no one else would. And sometimes that small step could mark the beginning of a story far larger than anyone could have imagined. The next morning, the cowboy awoke to the soft light of dawn spilling across the plains. His horse, sturdy and patient, nickered quietly as he adjusted the saddle and tightened the straps on the bags he had filled with supplies. Today, he would return to the small, forgotten house at the edge of town. Something had drawn him there, something beyond mere curiosity. It was the faint hope of helping someone who had been overlooked for far too long. The ride was slow, steady, across the familiar dirt paths. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of earth and grass, and the horizon glowed with soft pink and gold. The cowboy's mind wandered back to the widow's face, the mix of exhaustion, relief, and something he thought might be hope. Her eyes had spoken volumes even without words. He adjusted his hat and focused on the task at hand, bringing her food, clean clothes, and a sense that she was not forgotten. Upon reaching the house, he noticed it in a new light. The morning sun highlighted the cracks in the paint, but it also brought warmth to the worn wooden boards. The weeds in the yard seemed less threatening now, almost like wild guardians of a place that had seen years of hardship. The chimney still emitted a thin curl of smoke, proof that life continued inside. He dismounted carefully, patting his horse, and walked toward the door. This time, the widow greeted him with a faint, hopeful smile. Her hair was slightly cleaner, and the pale lines of exhaustion on her face seemed a little softened. She had tried to tidy the small room as best she could, but it was clear that living alone had made even small tasks difficult. The cowboy set down the bags of supplies and opened them carefully, letting her see the variety of items inside: bread, fresh vegetables, dried meat, butter, sugar, and a few small comforts like a blanket and a tin cup. She moved slowly, carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the food.
I don't know how to thank you, she whispered, her voice soft but filled with emotion. The cowboy shook his head. No thanks needed. Just eat. That's all that matters.
As she began to eat, he noticed how thin she had become. Days, perhaps even weeks, without proper meals had taken their toll. Her hands shook as she held the bread, and her eyes, though grateful, held a shadow of sorrow. He didn't comment. Didn't ask questions immediately. Instead, he waited, offering her water from a small tin he carried. Each sip seemed to revive her slightly, and he could see her strength returning bit by bit. After she had eaten a little, he spoke softly about small things, about the weather, the journey he had taken to reach her, and a few harmless stories from the road. At first, she remained quiet, listening with cautious curiosity. But gradually, she began to share small details about her life. The passing of her husband, the struggles of keeping the house, and the endless days of loneliness. Her words were slow and careful, as if sharing them aloud might somehow make them real. The cowboy listened patiently, never interrupting. He had learned long ago that some stories needed to be heard, not judged or corrected. There was dignity in listening, in allowing someone to speak without fear of ridicule or pity. As she spoke, he could see her shoulders relax, the tension in her hands ease. It was a subtle change, almost imperceptible, but he noticed. It was the first sign of trust forming between them. Over the following days, he returned regularly, bringing more food, water, and small necessities. Each visit, he stayed a little longer, helping with minor repairs around the house. A broken shutter here, a loose floorboard there. The widow began to rely on his presence, not out of desperation, but out of a growing recognition that she was no longer alone. Her smiles became more frequent, her movements less hesitant, and her voice stronger. One afternoon, he brought a small pot and some simple ingredients to make a meal together. As they cooked, she watched him with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. He worked quietly, chopping vegetables, stirring the pot, and humming softly under his breath. She joined when she could, and though clumsy at first, she gradually regained confidence in small tasks. By the time the meal was ready, the room was filled with a warmth beyond the fire or the stove. It was a warmth of companionship, of trust slowly building. As they ate, she spoke of her husband with gentle fondness, recalling the small joys they had shared. The laughter at simple meals, the quiet evenings spent reading together, the pride he had taken in his work. There was sadness in her voice, but also a quiet strength. The cowboy listened, offering silent understanding. He didn't try to replace the past or erase her grief. He only offered the presence of someone who cared. Over time, the widow began to open up about her fears and insecurities. She admitted she had been afraid of being alone forever, that she had lost hope of ever finding companionship or comfort again. The cowboy didn't rush her. He knew that trust, once broken or neglected, could not be rebuilt overnight. He continued to visit, his actions steady and predictable, proving through consistency that he could be relied upon. The town noticed the change as well. Neighbors who had once whispered about the widow's plight began to see her differently. Some watched quietly from a distance, surprised at how her house seemed less lonely, more alive. They didn't intrude, but they observed the small acts of kindness that had begun to transform her world. The cowboy remained respectful, never seeking recognition or reward for his actions, simply content to see her regain a sense of dignity. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with deep orange and violet, the cowboy stayed longer than usual. They had shared a simple supper, and the widow had begun to hum softly a song her husband had once taught her. It was a fragile melody, but it carried resilience and memory. The cowboy listened quietly, feeling the weight of the day and the quiet miracle of trust, forming in such a small, worn house. As darkness settled, he prepared to leave, but the widow spoke up. "Will,
Will you come again tomorrow?
Her voice was hesitant, almost shy, but it carried a note of hope he had not heard before. He nodded.
I will.
Don't worry, I'll be here.
The simple promise brought a warmth to the room that no fire could match. She nodded, feeling safer, knowing someone cared enough to return to stand by her side in small, steady ways. That night, as he rode back across the plains, the cowboy reflected on what he had witnessed. Life could be harsh, unforgiving, and lonely, but it could also be transformed by small acts of compassion and patience. He thought about the widow's strength, her resilience despite years of hardship, and felt a quiet admiration. Sometimes true courage wasn't found in facing storms or wild animals. It was found in opening one's heart to trust again, in allowing oneself to accept help after years of struggle. The following weeks passed in a rhythm of quiet work and companionship. The cowboy brought supplies, helped repair the house, and shared stories of his travels. The widow, in turn, shared her memories, her fears, and her small joys. They laughed together when a meal turned out differently than expected or when a floorboard creaked underfoot. They shared moments of silence, comfortable in the presence of one another. Slowly, the house seemed to brighten, not through paint or repairs alone, but through the life and warmth returning to its walls.
Neighbors began to notice subtle changes as well.
The widow, once withdrawn and quiet, now greeted passers-by with a nod or a soft word. The house, once dark and foreboding, seemed more inviting.
Even the animals in the yard, timid at first, began to approach, sensing the kindness and stability that now filled the home.
And though no one openly spoke of it, the town seemed to breathe a little easier, as if acknowledging that small acts of care could ripple outward, touching lives beyond the immediate scene. The cowboy, too, felt a change within himself. He had been a traveler for years, moving from town to town, carrying his own burdens silently. But now he understood the quiet power of connection, of being present for someone in need.
Each visit, each shared meal, each simple conversation strengthened a bond that was still new but growing steadily. He had no expectations, only the desire to help, and yet he found a sense of fulfillment he had never known on the road.
One rainy afternoon, when the wind howled through the cracks in the old house, the widow sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket he had brought. She looked at him, gratitude and trust shining in her eyes.
"I don't know what I would have done without you," she said softly. He shook his head, smiling faintly. "You'd have found a way. You're stronger than you think." "I'm just here to help." His words were simple, but they carried truth, humility, and a quiet respect for the life she had endured.
As the storm raged outside, they continued to talk, sharing stories, memories, and small dreams for the future. It was in these moments, simple, quiet, unremarkable to the world at large, that trust deepened and hope returned. The widow, once trapped in loneliness and hunger, now felt seen, valued, and cared for. And the cowboy, once a solitary traveler, discovered that even the most rugged heart could find warmth and purpose in helping another soul. By the time the sun returned, breaking through clouds and washing the plains in light, a small transformation had taken place. The widow was no longer merely surviving, she was beginning to live again. And the cowboy, steady and dependable, had become an unexpected anchor in her world.
Their story, still in its earliest chapters, was quietly unfolding, built on kindness, patience, and the simple, profound act of showing up when someone needed help most.
Days turned into weeks, and the bond between the cowboy and the widow grew steadily, quietly, without any need for grand gestures or loud declarations. Every visit he made became part of a routine that neither of them had expected, but both had come to rely on. The widow's home, once dark and silent, now held a gentle warmth. The fire always burned steadily in the hearth, the small table was usually set with fresh bread or vegetables, and the air smelled faintly of herbs and freshly baked goods. Each morning she would rise, not with dread or despair, but with a cautious hope that someone would come, that help would arrive. The cowboy began to notice subtle changes in her. Her posture, once hunched and weary, became more upright. Her movements, slow and hesitant at first, became deliberate and confident. She would sweep the floors, patch holes in the walls, and tend to a tiny garden she had neglected for years. The plants began to sprout again under her care, a living sign of the life returning to the home. And with every act of care, the cowboy watched quietly, sometimes offering a word of advice, sometimes merely helping lift a heavy bucket or steadying a chair. At first, she had been shy and cautious. She would step back whenever he came too close, and her words were measured, polite, but distant. But over time, trust began to bloom. It was a slow, fragile process, built on consistency, small gestures, and a respect for her dignity. He never forced himself into her space, never demanded anything from her. Instead, he showed through his actions that he could be relied upon. Each day he returned with fresh supplies, a little food, perhaps a blanket or warm clothes. And each day she found herself smiling a little more, speaking a little more freely, laughing at small jokes or the stories he shared from the road. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with orange and gold, the cowboy helped her fix a broken shutter on the window. She held the wood steady while he nailed it into place, and together they stepped back to admire their work. "It looks stronger than it has in years," she said softly. "Stronger than me sometimes," he replied, with a hint of a smile. She laughed quietly at the remark, and in that laugh he heard relief, joy, and a spark of life returning to her heart. Their conversations became more personal over time. She shared stories of her husband, the small joys of their life together, and the moments that had once brought her happiness. He, in turn, shared tales from the road. Adventures, challenges, the kindness of strangers, and the occasional danger that had shaped him. Through these exchanges, they began to see each other not just as helper and helped, but as companions, each with their own past, their own burdens, and their own capacity for resilience. The widow admitted that she had often feared the world outside her home. Loneliness, hunger, and hardship had made her cautious, suspicious even of strangers. But the cowboy had shown her that not everyone came with ill intent. His quiet presence, his consistent kindness, and his refusal to judge or take advantage of her vulnerability began to dissolve the fear that had gripped her for so long. She learned that trust, once lost, could be rebuilt, one small gesture at a time. One morning he arrived with supplies and found her struggling to lift a bucket of water from the well. He moved beside her without a word, taking the bucket and filling it with ease. "It's easier with two," he said simply. She smiled, a little embarrassed but grateful. That simple moment became symbolic of their relationship, mutual respect, quiet cooperation, and the understanding that life was not meant to be faced entirely alone. Over time, he began to teach her small skills he had learned on his travels: how to mend a broken fence, tend to the small garden, and preserve food for the winter. She absorbed these lessons eagerly, not only for the practical help they provided, but also for the sense of independence and self-sufficiency they restored in her. She began to see herself as capable again, a woman who could manage her life with the right support, not someone weak or helpless. Their afternoons often passed in quiet companionship. Sometimes they worked side by side on repairs or gardening. Sometimes they sat by the fire, sharing stories or simply enjoying the peaceful silence. There was no rush, no expectation, only the gentle rhythm of shared life. The widow began to look forward to these moments, not out of necessity but out of a growing attachment, a recognition that her heart was opening once more after so many years of loneliness. The townspeople started noticing the change as well. The widow, who had once been invisible to many, now carried herself with quiet dignity. She greeted neighbors politely, even smiling at children who passed by. Her home, once a place of shadow and decay, now looked cared for and welcoming. And while the cowboy never sought acknowledgement, his actions did not go unnoticed. People began to see the subtle transformation his presence had brought: a life renewed, hope restored, and a gentle companionship that spoke louder than words. One chilly evening, as the wind swept across the plains, the cowboy stayed later than usual. They had shared a meal together, simple but nourishing, and the widow had confided a story from her youth. It was a tale of adventure and laughter, a time when life had seemed full of possibilities. As she spoke, he listened intently, sensing the spark of her spirit returning. When she finished, she looked at him with a shy smile. "I haven't laughed like that in a long time," she admitted.
He nodded, understanding. "Sometimes it takes someone else to remind us what it feels like," he said softly.
As the weeks continued, they faced small challenges together. The roof leaked during a sudden rainstorm, the garden struggled to grow in patches of poor soil, and the firewood supply occasionally ran low.
Each obstacle became an opportunity to work together, to learn patience, and to rely on one another's strengths. Through these shared trials, their bond deepened.
The widow learned that it was not weakness to accept help, and the cowboy discovered the quiet joy of being needed, of providing support without expectation. In the evenings, when the work was done and the fire burned warmly, they often sat side by side, sharing quiet conversations about dreams, memories, and hopes for the future. She spoke of her desire to see the garden flourish, to keep the house in good repair, and to live with dignity. He shared tales of distant plains, wide open skies, and the countless travelers he had met along the way. Through these exchanges, they began to see not only the present, but the possibilities of a shared life, one built on trust, care, and mutual respect. The widow admitted one day that she had been afraid to hope. The years of loss and hardship had taught her that life could be cruel, that kindness was rare, and that trust often led to disappointment. But the cowboy had shown her that hope could return, that trust could be rebuilt, and that life could once again hold small joys. She learned to smile without fear, to laugh without hesitation, and to accept care without shame. For his part, the cowboy realized that his journey had changed.
The open road had always been his home, the horizon his companion, and solitude his comfort. But now he felt a connection deeper than the passing of towns or the thrill of adventure. He had become a part of someone's life, someone who had endured hardship and yet still held the capacity for joy, gratitude, and love. It was a new kind of fulfillment, one that filled the spaces solitude had left empty for so long. By the end of the month, the quiet routine had formed. The widow no longer hesitated when he arrived. She greeted him with warmth, and their conversations flowed naturally. The house, once silent and shadowed, now rang with laughter, light, and the soft hum of activity. Even the animals, once skittish, now roamed the yard with confidence, sensing the harmony within the household. Together they had transformed the small, forgotten house into a home filled with life, hope, and companionship. The cowboy's presence had done more than bring food or fix broken furniture. It had brought a sense of stability, a rhythm of life, and a quiet reassurance that she was not alone. And in return, the widow had brought warmth to his heart, a reason to stay, and the realization that connection could bring meaning beyond the freedom of the open plains. In moments of quiet reflection, the widow would sit by the fire and think about how far she had come. She had faced the despair of hunger, isolation, and grief, and yet through small, consistent acts of kindness, she had found trust again. She had rediscovered laughter, conversation, and the gentle comfort of companionship. And when she looked at the cowboy, she saw not just a helper or a friend, but a presence that had become essential in ways words could not fully capture. The cowboy, too, reflected on the quiet transformation within himself. He had traveled for years, seeking purpose, carrying his own burdens, and learning to survive alone. Yet now he had found a place to belong, a role that mattered, and a connection that brought a quiet joy he had never anticipated. Through patience, care, and consistent presence, he had helped restore a life, and in doing so had discovered a new dimension to his own. And so, life continued in a rhythm of quiet companionship. Each day brought small challenges, minor triumphs, and moments of laughter. Together they repaired, cooked, planted, and shared stories. And through these shared experiences they learned the power of trust, the importance of patience, and the simple, profound truth that kindness, when consistent, could heal even the most worn and weary heart. The days grew longer as spring fully settled over the plains, painting the hills with fresh green and soft wildflowers. The small house at the edge of town, once dark and empty, now seemed alive with gentle warmth and quiet laughter. The widow moved through the rooms with purpose, tending to the hearth, mending clothes, and caring for her small garden. The cowboy, who had once been a solitary traveler with no place to truly call home, was now a steady presence at her side.
Each day they shared, each small task completed together, deepened the bond that had quietly grown over the weeks. The cowboy arrived one morning with the sun just peeking over the horizon, the saddlebags heavy with fresh supplies. Bread, vegetables, dried meat, and a few small treats for her and the household filled the bags. But it was the routine itself, the simple act of being there, that mattered most. The widow greeted him warmly, her smile bright, and she moved with confidence now, no longer shadowed by fear or doubt.
"Good morning," she said softly. "I've started planting more in the garden today. I hope you don't mind getting your hands dirty." He chuckled quietly, setting down the bags and stepping into the garden. "I don't mind at all. It's been too long since I've seen green things grow." Together they worked, turning soil, planting seeds, and watering the small plot. Each seed seemed to represent a promise, not just of food, but of life, hope, and the possibility of new beginnings. The widow paused occasionally to glance at him, noting how careful and patient he was. Even the way he worked, steady and gentle, carried a quiet lesson about trust, care, and partnership. Over the following weeks, their days fell into a rhythm of shared effort and companionship. They repaired broken shutters, strengthened the roof against the occasional spring storm, and prepared food together. The widow found herself smiling more often, her laughter becoming a part of the daily routine.
It was a sound that had been absent from the house for years, replaced once only by the silence of solitude. The cowboy, in turn, found satisfaction in her happiness, in the small victories that were more meaningful than any challenge he had faced on the open road.
As the weeks turned into months, their connection became undeniable. There was a comfort in their presence together, a sense that life, which had been difficult and lonely for so long, could now be shared, lightened by companionship.
The widow confided in him more freely, speaking of her dreams for the house, the garden, and the life she wanted to build.
She admitted that she had feared being alone forever, that she had doubted she could ever trust again.
But now with him those fears seemed to melt, replaced by cautious hope and a growing sense of security. The cowboy, too, felt the quiet shift within himself. For years he had wandered the plains alone, his only companions the horse he rode and the open road. But now he understood the value of staying, of investing care and time into someone else's life. He realized that strength was not only in surviving the journey, but in offering support, love, and protection to someone who needed it. And in return, he found a sense of fulfillment, warmth, and belonging that he had never experienced. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the widow invited him to sit by the fire. She had prepared a simple meal of fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and stew. They ate quietly at first, savoring the food and the comfort of each other's presence. Then, as the fire crackled, she spoke softly, her voice filled with emotion.
"I never thought I could feel safe again, or that someone would care for me like you do. You've changed my life more than you know."
The cowboy nodded quietly, his eyes reflecting the flickering firelight.
"I didn't come to change your life," he said gently. "I came to help. You did the rest yourself." His words were humble, but she understood their depth.
He had not only brought supplies and comfort, he had brought trust, patience, and unwavering presence. And that had allowed her to heal, to feel alive again, and to embrace life with hope.
The days continued in a blend of work, laughter, and quiet reflection. They planted more in the garden, repaired more of the house, and prepared for the coming seasons. Each task, no matter how small, became a shared accomplishment. She learned to take pride in her abilities again, while he learned the subtle art of care and compassion beyond survival. Together they built a rhythm, a life, and a home that neither had imagined possible in the loneliness of their separate pasts. One day, as spring gave way to summer, the widow and the cowboy sat on the small porch, watching the fields sway in the warm breeze. She leaned against him gently, feeling the steady strength of his presence. "I never thought I'd find someone to share my life with again," she admitted. He smiled, tipping his hat slightly. "Sometimes life brings unexpected companions. You just have to be open to them." Their relationship grew naturally, built on mutual respect, care, and the understanding that love could be gentle, patient, and steady. There was no rush, no grand gestures, only the quiet intimacy of shared life, They celebrated small victories together: a repaired roof, a flourishing garden, a day without struggle. They shared stories of the past, hopes for the future, and dreams of a life filled with warmth, safety, and companionship.
The townspeople began to notice the transformation as well. The widow, once quiet and withdrawn, now walked with confidence and grace.
Her home, once neglected and shadowed, was now cared for, vibrant and welcoming. Children played in the yard, neighbors stopped to say hello, and the air seemed lighter. And though the cowboy remained humble and quiet, his role in this change was clear. He had been the steady presence that allowed hope to grow again. As the seasons passed, the couple settled into a comfortable rhythm of life together.
They shared meals, chores, and quiet evenings by the fire. The widow taught him small skills he had never learned: how to tend the garden carefully, preserve fruits and vegetables, and care for the small animals that now roamed the yard.
In return, he shared his knowledge of the land, survival, and the patience learned from years of travel. Their lives intertwined naturally, each contributing to the growth and stability of the other.
One winter evening, as snow fell softly outside, the widow and the cowboy sat together by the fire. The house was warm, the garden covered in a blanket of white, and the air smelled faintly of pine and smoke. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames.
"I never imagined life could feel this full again," she said softly. "I feel safe, cared for, and happy." He nodded, understanding without needing words. "You've done the hard part," he said gently. "You've kept going, even when it was hard. I just helped along the way." His humility only deepened her respect and affection for him.
In that quiet moment, there was no need for more than presence, trust, and the shared acknowledgement of what they had built together. The couple continued to face life's small challenges, but they faced them as a team.
The widow no longer feared storms, hunger, or loneliness, and the cowboy no longer wandered endlessly searching for purpose. They had found in each other a steady companion, a partner in life, and a source of quiet strength. Each day brought new opportunities to nurture their home, their hearts, and their shared future. The seasons shifted once more, and the garden they had tended together flourished.
Flowers bloomed, vegetables ripened, and the house, once forgotten, now stood as a symbol of resilience and hope. Friends from the town would occasionally stop by, bringing greetings and small gifts, noting the transformation that had taken place. And though the couple welcomed visitors, they cherished the quiet moments alone, the shared glances, and the unspoken understanding that their lives were now intertwined. One summer evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills, the widow and the cowboy sat together on the porch, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold. They held hands, feeling the warmth and steady presence of each other. The journey that had begun with a chance visit and a simple act of kindness had led to something far greater than either could have imagined. It was a life of companionship, trust, and shared joy. A life rebuilt from hardship and hope, nurtured by patience, care, and the quiet power of connection.
And so, their story continued, not with grand adventures or dramatic events, but with the simple, steady rhythm of shared life. Each day brought work, laughter, conversation, and the small victories that made life meaningful.
The widow, once lonely and starving, now lived with comfort, dignity, and the knowledge that she was loved. The cowboy, once a solitary traveler, now had a home, a partner, and a sense of belonging he had never known.
Together, they had built a life from kindness, trust, and the quiet magic of caring for one another. In the evenings, they would often sit by the fire, watching the flames dance and reflect on the journey that had brought them together.
The widow would smile softly, feeling the warmth of the cowboy's presence beside her. He, in turn, would glance at her, seeing the strength, resilience, and beauty that had grown from hardship and hope.
And in that shared silence, they understood the deepest truth of their story: that life could be rebuilt, hearts could be healed, and two people could find in each other a home that went far beyond walls and shelter. It was a home of trust, love, and shared life,